Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome to Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I'm Eddie, and today I want to talk about one of my absolute favorite musicals, West Side Story. West Side Story is one of the most significant shows in the history of musical theater. It completely changed the game in terms of what kinds of stories could be told in a musical, and how those stories could be told. So we're going to talk about the backstory of West Side Story. And there are four major characters in the backstory of West Side Story. Leonard Bernstein, the composer, Stephen Sondheim, the lyricist, Arthur Lawrence, the librettist, or the guy who wrote the script, and Jerome Robbins, the director and choreographer. These are four of the most influential names in musical theater history, and they all contributed to large catalogs of notable works. For example, Bernstein wrote Candide and the Tony Best musical winner Wonderful Town. Lawrence wrote the books for other famous shows like Gypsy. Robbins directed and or choreographed a bunch of shows, including Gypsy and Fiddler on the Roof and a bunch of other stuff. And then, of course, Sondheim is easily the most famous of the four, often argued to be the best lyricist in musical theater, and he is famous for writing shows like Into the Woods, Sweeney Todd, and Company. Each of these men had huge careers in the world of musical theater, so it's no surprise that the musical that had the biggest splash is the one that they all worked on together. West Side Story is lauded as one of the greatest musicals of all time. But what made it so important? Let's start with a rundown of what West Side Story even is. If you haven't seen the musical from 1957, which had an iconic film adaptation in 1961, it's basically Romeo and Juliet, but instead of Capulets, it's a Puerto Rican street gang called the Sharks, and instead of Montagues, it's a white gang called the Jets. My understanding is that the Jets are comprised of immigrants and sons of immigrants from Italian, Irish, and Eastern European countries, but that's not explicitly stated in the musical, beyond a quick mention of the male lead, Tony, being of Polish descent. The reason that I bring that up is that those demographics were discriminated against in 1950s New York, where West Side Story is set. Basically, we seem to be seeing two groups of people at the bottom of the social ladder fighting with each other for what little turf they can get. This bit of background, while obscured in the details of the story, is important because it means that this show isn't about good guys versus bad guys. The Jets and the Sharks both do bad things, which we should expect. They're gangs. But they're not the villains of the story. That title goes to society, which is represented by the police officers, Lieutenant Schrank and Officer Krupke. West Side Story looks like a shallow, love-at-first-sight kind of story, but the meat of the story is the challenges the youth face at the bottom of the social ladder. In 1950s America, these teenagers are teenagers who either immigrated to this country or have parents who did, whose parents are likely broken and worn down from World War II, and who have no real resources to help them succeed. This theme is exemplified in the song Gee Officer Krupke, where Sondheim demonstrates how the Jets are frustrated with the social system and the barriers that it imposes upon them, including unhappy home lives, with solutions requiring more hoops to jump through than a Kafka novel. Gee Officer Krupke is a fun and humorous song that demonstrates exactly what made West Side Story significant. It takes dark subject matter, in this case juvenile delinquency, and expands upon it in a palatable way. What makes this different from older musicals like Oklahoma and Carousel? Those musicals included dark themes, such as domestic violence, but put them in the background of a larger love story. West Side Story is doing something similar. However, West Side Story does not shy away from the implications of the theme it discusses. Carousel and Oklahoma wrap up their dark underlying themes in pretty bows, so much so that 70 years later, people largely seem to interpret Carousel as depicting domestic violence in a positive light. That's a discussion for another episode. Anyway, West Side Story doubles down on the darkness. If it means killing off two significant characters at the end of the first act, so be it. Spoiler, I guess, but it's been since 1957, guys. And what a way to end the act. Musicals had never been so grim. And the creators of West Side Story were stunned that the show was received as well as it was. They thought that move would be the death of the show. As I said, musicals had never been so grim. There's a time and a place for tragic stories, and as far as theatergoers of the 1950s were concerned, that place was the Opera House. Broadway was for musical comedies. That's what the genre was originally called, musical comedy. West Side Story was not an accident. Composer Leonard Bernstein wanted to write an operatically tragic story using the tools of musical comedy. This meant lighter, jazzy music that you'd be humming the next day, and that's exactly what he produced. Although some songs like One Hand, One Heart do feel like they'd fit right in with an operetta. Bernstein was actually composing an operetta called Candide at the time, and I've heard that some songs written for one show ended up in the other. Anyway, this goal of Bernstein's to write a musical comedy that was a tragedy was a total game changer. Think of the most famous musicals that have come out since West Side Story. Gypsy, Cabaret, Sweeney Todd, Rent, Hamilton. Okay, I guess the most famous would be Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera, Rent, Wicked, Hamilton. But it doesn't matter. All of those musicals have tragic elements to them, even if they aren't literally a tragedy. They all provide commentary on some depressing social topic, whether it's racism or oppression or disease, gentrification, so forth. None of these shows would exist if Leonard Bernstein hadn't made this goal of writing a tragic musical comedy. Jerome Robbins, the choreographer, also had a goal for how to tell the story. He wanted to tell the story as much through dance as through words. People joke about how unintimidating gangs are when they twirl and snap, but the ballet dancing contributed massively to the success of the show. It provided enough levity to the fight scenes, enough ambiguity to the assault scene, and enough elegance to the vicious gang members that they were able to get away with all the fighting and killing that happens on stage. I don't know if West Side Story would have gotten very far without that choreography. Not in 1957. And then, this was, of course, Sondheim's first Broadway show. He was only the lyricist for this show. After West Side Story and Gypsy, he almost always wrote both the music and the lyrics. But this was his first go, and he was just the lyricist. And in these lyrics, he already has some of his lyrical trademarks. One of my favorite examples of a para-rhyme, I'm depraved on account of I'm deprived, from G. Officer Krupke. A para-rhyme is what you get with depraved and deprived. It's the opposite of assonance if you think about syllable structure, where the vowel is the only part of the word that's not matched. Depraved, deprived. Sondheim also works with rhymes that only work in the character's accents. There's a line in I Feel Pretty. Have you met my good friend Maria? And then later, you'll notice the moment you see her. Those don't rhyme in most dialects of English, but based on the rhyme scheme of I Feel Pretty, you can tell Maria and see her are supposed to rhyme. Maria, Sia. And that's actually fascinating because you can tell that that's Sondheim trying to imitate a Puerto Rican English accent, where Spanish speakers would often have trouble with H's. I believe Puerto Rican Spanish is actually a dialect or a group of dialects that have the H sound, but, still, H's are typically very difficult for Spanish speakers. And then rhotic vowels, those R-colored vowels like are also extremely difficult to learn if you're not a native speaker of a language that contains them, and Spanish is not one of those languages. So I find this is one of my favorite rhymes in West Side Story. Maria and Sia, because Sondheim did a great job of trying to capture how those characters would actually rhyme in their native dialect. Well, in the dialect that they've learned, that is. And then finally, Arthur Lawrence's libretto is both iconic and groundbreaking. It features famously odd slang, which was largely made up in order to prevent the show from feeling dated, and it features very dark themes. The story that the musical tells was progressive for its era, highlighting Latine issues, but not diving particularly deeply into them, creating roles for Latine performers, but not exclusively hiring for them. As the show has evolved over the years, it has improved its depiction of Latinas. The song America is a notable example of this. Sondheim and Lawrence, who came from Eastern European Jewish families, wrote the Sharks with the same attitudes regarding Puerto Rico as they themselves grew up seeing regarding Eastern Europe. However, the plights that drove Eastern European Jews to America in the early 1900s were rather different from those that drove Puerto Ricans to New York in the 1950s. But Sondheim and Lawrence apparently thought an immigrant is an immigrant and looked no further into the Puerto Ricans' attitudes toward their homelands. Over the years, Sondheim and maybe Lawrence, I haven't heard, had put efforts into amending this. Firstly, by working with Lin-Manuel Miranda to incorporate Spanish into the Sharks' lyrics in the 2009 revival on Broadway, and then by rewriting America entirely for the second film adaptation in 2021. By the second movie, West Side Story has evolved into a more thorough depiction of the struggles that both gangs face. There are no heroes to the story. Both sides do horrible things. Like I said, the villain is represented by Lieutenant Schrank, and is the society that pits these gangs together, that promotes juvenile delinquency. The only character in the show that you should root for is Anita. Everyone else is terrible, and they're meant to be. Written a decade after the Second World War ended, West Side Story discusses how challenging adolescence was in a society where the adults were absent or dealing with war trauma. It depicts a dark, realistic contrast to the common vision of the 1950s America that focused on nuclear families. So that's all I've got for the background and arguments for West Side Story, but I did listen to every single album of West Side Story that is on Spotify, so I want to talk about those. So the first album that came out that's on Spotify, I'm sure there's plenty of albums that I'm missing because they just aren't on Spotify, and I'll get to those eventually, but for now. The original Broadway cast recording in 1957, starring Larry Kert as Tony, Carol Lawrence as Maria, and Chita Rivera as Anita. The standout performance in this original album is Larry Kert as Tony. The Jets sound very brash in this production, which is appropriate. They're gang members that they should probably sound pretty brash. But Larry Kert has a very smooth sound. He just sounds very, very nice. And so the highlights from the album for me are the songs Maria and One Hand, One Heart. The accents of the Puerto Rican characters were inconsistent. They weren't used half the time, which is just weird. And I've talked before about how accents in musical theater, I talked about that in my musical, what was it called? The lyrical realism episode, which was my previous episode. How it's very common for theater to use accents for specific purposes, but not use them consistently. These accents were very overdone in America, which is usually a catchy song. It's usually one of my favorite songs, and it just felt annoying in this production. Despite the seemingly random dropping of accents, I did notice that they made sure to pronounce "see her" in such a way that it rhymed with Maria and "I feel pretty." I can just assume that, I can picture Sondheim just breathing down these singers' necks in rehearsal, making sure you will pronounce that as Sia. And that was funny. But, yeah. Ultimately, it's not a bad recording. I would give it like an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. Except for certain songs like America. I was really hoping to like Chita Rivera's Anita more, and maybe it's Well, she was a fantastic dancer. She was one of the most iconic triple threats in Broadway history, so I'm sure she did a fantastic job in it in general. But I didn't particularly enjoy how she came off in the album. Next is the film adaptation of 1962. The original West Side Story movie is iconic, and I can actually talk about the whole movie here, not just the album that's on Spotify. It's an iconic movie. It's not one that I return to often, though. Jerome Robbins' choreography is incredible, perhaps the best of any movie musical out there. Like I said earlier, he set out to tell the story as much through dance as through words, and he pulled it off fantastically. And I already talked about how important that was for the musical to succeed without deterring the audience with the violence. Right, gangs are less intimidating when they dance ballet in unison and when they snap and whatnot. I like the use of color in the film, with the Jets being represented by blue and yellow and the Sharks by red and purple. That was a nice contrast. Disappointingly, but unsurprisingly, the movie almost solely cast white actors as the Sharks and had them perform in brownface. The brownface and the heavily stereotyped accents bring the quality of the film down quite a bit. Even Rita Moreno, who played Anita, one of the only actual Hispanic actors in the film, was directed to darken her skin. For 1962, it was still a very progressive movie for just talking about racism the way that it does. But for a contemporary audience, its portrayal of these issues feels uncomfortable. The accents, which are very stereotypical and extremely nasal, are annoying and distracting. George Chakiris, who played Bernardo, had such a lovely voice in the 1967 Kismet film, yet he sounds so grating in this film. Rita Moreno is the standout performer, unsurprisingly. She took home an Oscar for it, and she was the first Latina actor to do so. Natalie Wood provided the face for Maria. Marni Nixon, the longtime Hollywood ghost singer, provided the voice. Nixon's performance was good, if limited. Unlike other films like My Fair Lady, Nixon was brought in to dub the songs after the filming was done, so she found herself having to try to match Wood's timing and movements rather than Wood lip-syncing to Nixon's singing. This incident led to Nixon advocating for ghost actors to receive credit and better pay, as she realized how significant they were to the film. This film is worth watching for the choreography and the history, but it's not the best production or even the best movie adaptation of West Side Story. I would probably give it a 5 out of 10. I'm not a big fan of the movie. The next album that I want to talk about is Leonard Bernstein Conducts West Side Story, which came out in 1985, starring Jose Carreras as Tony, Kiri Tekanawa as Maria, and Titana Troyanos as Anita. I'm gonna give this one like a 6 out of 10. It feels weird to give such a low rating to opera singers. However, opera singers singing the jazzy music in West Side Story operatically is weirder. The singing is beautiful, but it is so formal. It's too formal to make the characters believable. The arrangement of the music is lovely, and what's cool is it contains some bits of music that get cut in other albums, such as there's an extra verse in the Jet song. The lack of sound effects from the fights, which are present in most other versions of West Side Story, allows the listener to really focus on the music more. It's a lovely album to listen to for good quality singing and music. It's just not the right album to tell the story. But I guess it depends on what you're looking for, and I might rank it higher if I'm just judging it on how the music sounds compared to how it tells West Side Story. The next album is the Nashville Symphony Orchestra's album that came out in 2002, starring Mike Eldred as Tony, Betsy Morrison as Maria, and Marianne Cook as Anita. I thought this one was alright, maybe like a 7 or 8 out of 10, I would say. I enjoyed it. There's a lot of dialogue in this one. I was annoyed by how much talking there is in Tonight, which is funny that I'm saying this because I'm saying that the last album that I talked about wasn't the best for telling the story, and now I'm complaining that this one tells the story too much. It really depends on what you're looking for here. Basically, if you're looking for putting these songs into a playlist, the Nashville Symphony Orchestra one might not be the best one to go with because there's a lot of dialogue. If you're looking for one that tells the story better, this one might be a good one for you. So there was a lot of talking. Maria's accent, I felt like, was largely just the R rolling. She didn't do a whole lot with the other sounds in her accent. And then what was interesting was this was one of the few instances of a stage production, well, I think it's a concert production, but still not a movie, that had America being sung by men and women, as opposed to just women. Right, in the movie adaptations, both movie adaptations, America is sung by, it's like a men versus women kind of thing. But in the stage production since 1957, it's always been all women. I believe that's because this was a scene that the men had to be off stage for because they were getting ready for the Rumble scene that comes shortly after. And that's why it was always just the women on the stage. I'm guessing that they would have preferred to have the men versus women America because that's how they did it in the movies. And it was just interesting to hear that in this production as well. Okay, and then there's the new Broadway cast recording in 2009. So this was a revival on Broadway with Matt Cavanaugh as Tony, Josefina Scaglione as Maria, and Karen Olivo as Anita. I love this version, and a huge part of it is something that I mentioned earlier. Lin-Manuel Miranda rewrote a lot of the lyrics for the Sharks. He rewrote them in Spanish. My Spanish is pretty mediocre at this point. I used to speak it okay. But I just love that we're using the two different languages in the same show now. And that is a real highlight for me. I love Karen Olivo's Anita. I think she did a good job. But yeah, for me, the big highlight of the new Broadway cast recording is the fact that it's in Spanish. Next one is Bernstein, West Side Story. This is an album from 2014, starring Cheyenne Jackson as Tony, Alexandra Silber as Maria, and Jessica Vosk as Anita. There is so much dialogue in this production, which again, that's great if you're listening for this in order to get the whole story told. When you're looking for songs to add to your playlist, maybe not the great one to do, but that's okay. But there's so much dialogue in this, which means you're actually getting more of the story in this album than I think in any of the other albums, because they've got all this dialogue in the Jet song. They've even got the jukebox scene, which is, I don't think, ever included in West Side Story's albums. This one, like the version with Kirita Kanawa, also contains that cut verse from the Jet song. Alexandra Silber as Maria sounded fantastic, although I noted while she sounded great in Tonight and One Hand, One Heart, I still don't like I Feel Pretty. And it's not because, like, she sounds good in it. I kind of generally hate that song. I'm not entirely sure why. I'll get more into that, I think, in the next album that we talk about. But yeah, I didn't like I Feel Pretty in this version. Quite frankly, I don't think I like I Feel Pretty in any of the versions that I've talked about yet. I was really excited to listen to Jessica Vosk playing Anita, even though this day and age she's probably not who we're supposed to be casting as Anita, if you catch my drift. But you know, Jessica Vosk, great singer. I was really looking forward to hearing how she did it. I found Anita very annoying in this production. Although I will say that I really did enjoy her A Boy Like That. Which is good because that's a great song when you do it right. Bernardo sounded great. I wasn't able to find his name, but he sounded really good. I noticed when listening to this one, and I don't think I've mentioned this yet, the Sharks sound lower than the Jets, which is interesting because that actually sort of goes against what I've been talking about regarding there not being heroes and villains. Because it's very, very common, especially in opera, which this isn't opera, but it's common in musical theater too, for good guys to have high voices and bad guys to have low voices. And so this is interesting in that I kind of wonder whether, well, I'm assuming that Leonard Bernstein did write that to be that way. But so it's possible that the Jets were meant to be seen more heroically than the Sharks. But I think that has changed in recent years, and it works better with that change, where neither of them are good guys. Yeah, so that's interesting. And then the last album that I want to talk about actually is the final movie adaptation from 2021. And so I'll talk about the movie itself as well. And there's so much to talk about with that. The movie that was starring Ansel Elgort as Tony, Rachel Zegler as Maria, and Ariana DeBose as Anita. And I love this movie so much. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. And a huge part of that is how Tony Kushner rewrote the story. He rewrote the script in such a way that it really reflects how Sondheim and Lawrence wanted it to be, you know, with the violence and the grittiness of it. And they rewrote it, fleshing out the characters so much. And, you know, they have actual motivations now. They have backstories now. And I just love it. You know, Maria has more agency, which makes her actually a worse person, I think, because, you know, like, you have there's that whole issue of, oh, you just killed my brother, here, let me sleep with you now. Right, that's a ridiculous thing to happen, and, you know, but, so she is a worse person, I would say, in this movie. That's not a new thing in this movie, it's just that the way she goes about doing the actions that she does throughout the whole movie, they feel more agentive, which means that, you know, she has more of a say, and she's not making great decisions. But they're her decisions to make, you know? And Ariana DeBose was fantastic as Anita. She did a really great job, especially in songs like A Boy Like That. That was a really haunting scene. Both Ariana and Rachel did a fantastic job in that scene. I'm going to get back to I Feel Pretty now, because I mentioned that one or two albums ago. And yeah, like I said, I Feel Pretty is generally a song I have always hated. From watching the Natalie Wood movie when I was 8 years old, I have always hated that song. Yeah, it turns out I only hate that song when Rachel Zegler isn't the singer. She absolutely killed it. I'm not even sure what it is about this song that I love now when Rachel Zegler sings it, but she just did such an amazing job with it. And because I loved how Rachel Zegler sang I Feel Pretty so much, I've been listening to it so much more, which means I've been listening to the lyrics a lot more and analyzing the lyrics more and breaking them down more. And that's how I find that, I've found that there's actually some interesting rhyming and stuff going on. You get the internal rhymes, like it's alarming how charming I feel, which Stephen Sondheim actually criticized his own lyrics for, because he said that seems too sophisticated for someone like Maria to be singing. But it sounds nice. But I agree in the sense that you should, as a lyricist for musical theater, be willing to make the sacrifices of cool sounding lyrics in favor of what fits the character. And as a musical theater lyricist myself, that is so hard to do. It is so difficult to make those sacrifices, because sometimes you come up with the coolest stuff and you can't always use it. Anyway, yeah, so the film adaptation 2021, that is my favorite version of West Side Story. I would give that a 10 out of 10. I absolutely adore it in every possible way, and yeah, if you haven't seen that one yet, I highly recommend it. So my favorite, my favorite cast for West Side Story, I would say my favorite Tony is probably Mike Eldred from that Nashville Symphony Orchestra 2002. He has a really, I think he did Tony very well. My favorite Maria is Rachel Zegler, although I will give an honorable mention to Alexandra Silber. But Rachel Zegler definitely wins on account of she's the only person who's ever made me like I Feel Pretty. Anita, I can give that to Ariana DeBose or maybe Karen Olivo. There's a lot of good Anitas out there. There were several Anitas on this list that I didn't care for. I think Ariana DeBose might be my favorite. She gets an advantage too because it's a movie, so I get to actually see the dancing and all of that and the acting. And so it's easy for her to win that. Bernardo, George Chakiris had the ability to be an amazing Bernardo, but he didn't get that opportunity in the sense that they made him put on that ridiculous accent, and it's so nasal and grating. But if you listen to his Khalif in Kismet, he just sounds so amazing. He would have been, I think, a much better Bernardo if he was allowed to, sing it in a more natural way. But the Bernardo in the 2014 album, I don't know his name. I wasn't able to find it. He sounded really good too. Anyway, that concludes this episode of Eddie's Encyclopedia of Musicals. I hope that it was interesting and informative, and I hope to have another episode out soon. Thank you.